You're nothing but a poor old farmer. Your land is worthless, and so are you." Those words weren't shouted by an enemy, but spoken by someone meant to be family. In that moment, the wound cut deeper than any blade. It wasn't just betrayal of trust. It was an attempt to erase a lifetime of work, to strip dignity away with a signature and a lie. That kind of wound doesn't heal overnight. It festers, it reshapes the soul, and it demands an answer. What followed was not anger, but resolve. The kind of resolve that turns pain into power and betrayal into a lesson no one would forget. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I was born and raised in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and at 69 years old, I still wake each morning to the same wide horizon I've known my entire life. The tall grass prairie rolls like a green and gold sea, stretching farther than the eye can follow. I walk the fields with my boots worn smooth from decades of work, and the dust clings to me the way it always has. My farm, Cole Prairie, covers 480 acres, a patch of earth handed down through 3 generations of my family. The house itself was built in 1919 by my grandfather. The roof creaks, the porch sags, and the paint is chipped, but it has stood through storms that tore newer homes apart. When the wind blows across the tin roof, it sounds like an old hymn. To the people of Cotton Creek, I am just Henry Cole, the farmer who still drives his 2016 Ford F-150 and buys tools at Farm and Fleet like everyone else. They see me in my faded overalls, my calloused hands, and they assume I live the life of a man with modest means, scraping by as farmers often do. That's the way I prefer it. Money changes how people treat you, and I have never been interested in being treated like a walking bank account. Respect matters more to me than any figure on a balance sheet. What most don't know, and what I've kept hidden for decades, is that behind the old machine shed stands a locked door. Beyond it lies Prairie Metrics Labs, the company I built quietly from one invention I created more than 30 years ago. Root depth sensors, soil moisture analytics, predictive modeling for sustainable farming. What started as a tinkerer's solution to my own questions about the land became a suite of tools used across the Midwest. Prairie Metrics has partnerships with universities, contracts with seed companies, and a valuation of more than $300 million. I own 61% of it, yet I've chosen to live like the man my neighbors think I am. I keep the offices small, the equipment tucked away, the patents stored in fireproof cabinets. My reason has always been simple. I didn't want to lose myself in the noise of wealth. I never wanted to walk into the diner downtown and hear whispers about stock prices instead of the weather. Farmers understand soil and rain, not corporate valuations, and I wanted to remain one of them. My wife, God rest her soul, believed in the same. She told me once, "Henry, never let money speak louder than the land." I've followed that advice like scripture. Family has always been complicated, though. My daughter Emily is 34 now, a music teacher at the local school. She's gentle, thoughtful, and more comfortable with a classroom of children than with balance sheets or deeds. I love her for that. She believes in the goodness of people, a belief that has carried her but also left her vulnerable. She married Scott Mercer, a man who came through town with ambition spilling out of every sentence. He dresses sharp, talks fast, and posts every second of his life online as if applause were oxygen. He calls himself an entrepreneur, but what he really has is a trail of debt and a knack for making others think he's standing on the edge of greatness. I tolerate him for Emily's sake, but I don't trust him. He has nudged me more than once to modernize or leverage the land. He talks about brand potential, tourism opportunities, solar farms, and quick sales. I nod and let him talk, though each word sits on me like grit in the teeth. He doesn't see the land as I do. He sees dollars and dirt and nothing more. Cotton Creek itself is a place where people wave at you on back roads, and the waitress at the diner knows whether you take cream in your coffee. News travels faster than the wind through the wheat fields, and reputations stick longer than dust in August. Around here, no one suspects that the man fixing a tractor at dawn could also be dialing into board meetings with investors by noon. That dual life is something I've carried with me for decades, and I've never regretted it. Still, there are days I wonder if secrecy has cost me something. Emily doesn't know the depth of what I've built, and Scott certainly doesn't. They see me as the old farmer with weathered hands, not as a man holding patents, contracts, and leverage that could buy half the county. Perhaps that is why Scott looks at me with a mixture of impatience and pity. He doesn't realize that the earth he stands on has already been fortified by safeguards I had designed long before he arrived. As I walk the boundary fences each evening, I think about legacy. Not the kind you boast about, but the kind you pass on through values and soil. Respect is not inherited, it's earned. My grandfather taught me that when he placed a shovel in my hands as a boy. My father reinforced it when he reminded me that every acre holds the sweat of those who worked it before, and now it falls to me to ensure the land is more than numbers on a deed. The prairie stretches silent under the setting sun, but I can almost sense a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Change is coming, though I cannot yet see its shape. I know only this. I am Henry Cole, farmer of Flint Hills, guardian of Cole Prairie, and keeper of secrets larger than most could imagine. If you're still watching and feel the weight of being underestimated, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move into Chapter 2, where the first cracks of betrayal begin to show. The first sign of change came not from the land, but from my own body. Late one evening in May, a sharp, searing pain gripped my abdomen so fiercely I thought I had been stabbed. By the time Emily rushed me to Wichita Regional, the doctors were already shaking their heads. Acute pancreatitis, they said, and I would need surgery followed by a long stay. The sterile hospital room smelled of antiseptic, its fluorescent lights humming like an angry hive. Through the small window, I could just barely see the prairie sky, still wide and endless, though it felt a world away. Before they wheeled me down the hall, I took Emily's hand and told her to water the flower bed her mother loved so much. To Scott, who stood with his blazer collar turned up as if he were attending a conference rather than a medical emergency, I asked him to keep an eye on the small chores around the farm. He gave me a half smile that carried no warmth. Maybe it's time the younger generation handled the big decisions now, he said. His tone was light, but the way his eyes lingered on me left me with an uneasy chill. That night, as Emily nodded off in the chair beside me, I heard Scott's voice outside the door. He was on the phone, his tone sharper than usual. "Golden land," he whispered, "and if we sign quickly, we can close before anyone thinks twice." My body ached, but my mind burned hotter than the pain in my gut. Emily, exhausted from hours of worry, slept without hearing a word. Scott slipped back into the room later, explaining that he had been arranging insurance forms, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed another story. The following morning, I caught a glimpse of Scott in the cafeteria, holding his phone out in front of him as if it were a mirror. He was live streaming. "Taking care of my father-in-law, tough decisions ahead, family first," he told his online audience. Hashtags scrolled across his screen. Hashtag financial literacy, hashtag generational wealth. To him, my illness was content, another chance to appear wise and ambitious to strangers. I said nothing, but the unease in my chest grew heavier than the pain of recovery. Lying in that hospital bed, I thought about the safeguards I had put in place. The Cole Prairie Land Trust, the covenants on the land, the right of first refusal clauses, all carefully written with Ruth Ellison's guidance to protect the farm from hasty hands. Yet Ruth's words echoed in my memory. Documents protect you only if people respect them. For the first time, I wondered if paper alone could withstand ambition, sharpened by greed. Emily did her best to keep my spirits up, but I could see the toll the strain was taking on her. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with fatigue, and she clung to Scott's reassurances more than she should have. When the hospital staff brought in forms, Scott leaned over her shoulder, urging her to sign while murmuring about coverage and approval. I watched her hand tremble, as she pressed the pen to paper, the ink soaking into lines she hadn't read. She wanted so desperately to trust, to believe her husband was acting in everyone's best interest. That night, as I lay awake, I remembered the steel cabinet beneath the farmhouse floorboards. Inside were the contracts, patents, and trust documents that secured both the land and prairie metrics. If I died suddenly, no one in my family fully understood the protections I had designed. I felt regret tighten my chest. I had shielded Emily from the world of legal battles and financial safeguards, thinking it would free her. Now, I feared it had left her exposed. Emily eventually curled up in the chair, her breathing deep and even. Scott touched her shoulder, whispering that he was going to sort out paperwork, then disappeared into the dark hallway. My heart raced, not from illness, but from the awareness that he was no caretaker. His eyes shone with calculation, not concern. I stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent light flickering like a warning I couldn't ignore. A soft buzz startled me. My phone lit up on the tray beside me. It was a message from Ruth. "When you're stable, we need to review the trust clauses. Call me." Her words felt like an omen. She knew, in her way, what I had begun to suspect. The walls I had built around the land were about to be tested. The nurse came in to dim the lights, and the room sank into quiet shadows. Emily slept, Scott was gone, and machines hummed steadily by my side. Outside, the prairie night stretched endless and dark, but I could feel it, like a storm gathering out of sight. The prairie holds steady, I thought to myself, but men do not. The first clear memory I have after surgery was of Scott's face hovering above me. My vision was still smeared around the edges, my chest tight from anesthesia, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the room. He smiled down at me, papers in his hands, speaking in a tone that tried to mimic care, but carried the smoothness of salesmanship. He said they were insurance forms, things that needed to be signed for my own protection, medical power of attorney, just in case. Emily stood beside him, her eyes ringed with fatigue and red from crying, nodding as if she understood. I wanted to believe them. My mind, fogged by medication, clung to trust more than reason. I scrawled my name on the lines without even reading. At the time, I told myself it was natural. What father wouldn't trust his daughter's husband in a moment of crisis? What father wouldn't reach for family when his body was too weak to argue? Yet the shame of that trust still lingers, because in that moment, I gave away more than a signature. I handed over the keys to my legacy. 3 days later, I was under again for a second procedure. While I drifted between life and oblivion, Scott made his move. He took that freshly notarized power of attorney straight to Cotton Creek Savings and Trust. He presented himself as the responsible son-in-law, the one stepping in for a father-in-law too sick to handle matters. The banker glanced at the stamp, saw the word authority, and nodded. No questions, no hesitation. In less than an hour, Scott had the power to dispose of everything my family had built. On June 22nd, at precisely 3:47 in the afternoon, Scott sold Coal Prairie to Harbor Rock Developments. 480 acres of tall grass prairie, farmland, and homestead. Signed away for $1,050,000. The appraised value of that land was nearly $3.9 million, but he offered it for a fraction, enough to make the developers smile at their good fortune. For them, it was a bargain. For me, it was theft wrapped in legal paper. The details of the transaction still burn in my mind. A cashier's check printed at the bank, crisp contract signed in haste, Scott shaking hands with Harbor Rock's representative, as if he were the rightful owner. 4 generations reduced to a cheap sale in the span of a single afternoon. It wasn't just the money that cut deep. It was the contempt. The land wasn't simply dirt. It was the sweat of my grandfather's back, the lessons of my father's calloused hands, the hours I had poured into both farming and innovation. It was a covenant with history. Scott treated it as disposable. What makes it worse is that he didn't do it to help. My hospital bills were already paid in full through the founder benefits of Prairie Metrics. Not a dime of my care relied on him. But he didn't bother to check or even ask. His aim was simple: fast cash, easy gain, the chance to live a life he thought he deserved. It didn't take long to see where the money went. Just days after the sale, pictures began flooding social media. Scott and Emily at the Tulsa Sky Resort, smiling in front of infinity pools, holding glasses of champagne that cost more than a month's groceries. Hashtags splattered across the posts. Number sign, living my best life. Number sign, blessed. Number sign, millionaire mindset. There they were in $8,000 a night suites, eating strawberries dipped in chocolate while I sat in physical therapy, learning to walk again with a belt strapped around my waist and a nurse at my side. Emily looked uncomfortable in some of the pictures, her smile thinner than his, but she didn't stop him. She let herself be swept along by his bravado, by the fantasy he wanted the world to see. From my hospital bed, I scrolled through those photos, my hands shaking. Not with envy, but with the hollow ache of betrayal. Money can be earned again, but trust, once fractured, is harder to rebuild. I stared at Scott's grin, his arm thrown around my daughter, as if he had conquered the world, and I felt the weight of something heavier than my own healing bones. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was celebrating the erasure of everything I had built. Weeks passed before I returned home, but the blow had already landed. One September morning, still sore from therapy, I opened the mail stacked high on the kitchen table. Among the bills and flyers was an envelope stamped with the Harbor Rock logo. Inside was a letter. Thank you for your recent land sale. Construction on Harbor Ridge Outlet Village will begin October 15th. My breath caught as I read those words. They were polite, even cheerful, but to me they sounded like a funeral bell. The land was gone, or so Scott thought. I gripped that letter with trembling fingers, the paper crinkling under the weight of my fury. For a long moment, I stared out at the horizon through my kitchen window, the prairie stretching calm and unbroken. My body was weak, but my resolve hardened. The storm I had feared was no longer approaching. It was here. When I finally gained enough strength to climb the courthouse steps in Cotton Creek, I asked for the transaction records. The clerk looked at me with polite confusion, but handed over the printouts without question. I sat on the wooden bench in the hallway, paper trembling in my hand, and read line after line of betrayal. The sale had gone through Cotton Creek Savings and Trust. $1,050,000 deposited into the joint account of Emily and Scott Mercer. Within 48 hours, $120,000 labeled as emergency withdrawal. A brand new truck for $28,000. $15,000 spent on something called an entrepreneurship seminar. The numbers told a story Scott would never admit aloud. Greed disguised as responsibility. It didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, I saw photographs online of Scott holding up tickets to the next Super Bowl. He told his followers that it wasn't about the game, it was about networking opportunities. He called the sale of the farm a financially savvy exit strategy, claiming he had repositioned family assets for long-term growth. The people who watched his live streams applauded with digital thumbs and heart emojis, while I sat in my kitchen staring at the cracked plaster above the stove, wondering how quickly a man could twist theft into wisdom. But I wasn't idle. Behind the barn, in the quiet office where Prairie Metrics still hummed on servers, I reached out to contacts who owed me favors. Within days, I had internal records showing Harbor Rock's plans. They didn't intend to keep the prairie as farmland. They had already listed it as Harbor Ridge Redevelopment Site, a blueprint for outlet malls and cookie-cutter subdivisions. My family's land, once strong with corn and cattle, was already reduced to lines on an architect's draft. I called Ruth Ellison, my attorney, and slid the documents across her desk. She studied them in silence, then looked up at me with her steady eyes. "Henry," she said, "the power of attorney you signed was limited to medical decisions only. Scott had no legal right to sell this land." She began drafting a demand letter immediately, warning the bank that they faced liability for authorizing the transfer. Her calm professionalism steadied me, though my hands still shook when I thought of Scott's smug grin. When I told Emily the truth, that every hospital bill had been covered by Prairie Metrics benefits, that Scott's excuse of needing money for my care was a fabrication, her face drained of color. She stared at me as if the floor had opened beneath her. "He told me," she whispered, but the words never finished. Her loyalty to him battled with the evidence in front of her. For the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes. For the first time, she realized her husband had gambled not only with my legacy, but with her trust. Ruth suggested we bide our time, that a confrontation would carry more weight if it happened in front of witnesses. Harbor Rock had scheduled a town hall for August 1st to present their grand plans for the outlet village. She advised me to wait until then, to let Scott dig his own hole deeper. I agreed, even though patience was bitter. Late that night, Scott's arrogance found its way to my phone. A message blinked on the screen. I only did what was practical. Time you learned to let me handle things. No apology, no explanation, just entitlement wrapped in condescension. I read it 3 times, then folded the phone shut without replying. Some words need no answer. They stand as evidence on their own. I spent the evenings walking the fence lines that Scott had claimed were falling apart. Fireflies rose from the grass, flickering like sparks against the dark horizon. The prairie had survived droughts that cracked the soil open, storms that flattened barns, locusts that darkened the sky. It would survive Scott Mercer, too. My boots pressed into the earth with the same rhythm my grandfather once carried. The land steadied me, reminding me of what endures and what passes. At Ruth's office, we prepared files and exhibits. Contracts, covenants, bank statements, all assembled in neat folders, waiting to be unveiled. Ruth tapped the stack with her pen. "If he wants to play in public," she said, "then public is where he'll fall." I carried the folders home and set them on the oak table where my family had shared meals for half a century. My father's hands once carved this wood, and my daughter's crayons once scratched across its surface. Now it would bear witness to the evidence of betrayal. I ran my palm over the grain and whispered, "If he wants to handle things, then let him try. This time, I'll be ready." The Cotton Creek Community Center smelled faintly of sawdust and floor wax, the kind of place where bake sales and town debates shared the same folding chairs. On August 1st, it was packed shoulder to shoulder. Farmers in denim jackets, small business owners in polos, and local council members with clipboards filled the room. Harbor Rock's banners stretched across the stage, bold letters announcing the future site of Harbor Ridge Outlet Village. A glossy artist's rendering showed neat rows of storefronts where my cattle once grazed. The air buzzed with cautious optimism. Jobs, commerce, progress. To many of them, it looked like a step forward. Scott Mercer strode to the podium in a crisp navy suit, his hair slicked back as if he were auditioning for television. Emily followed him, her pale face betraying unease, though she forced a polite smile. Scott adjusted the microphone and let the room quiet before beginning. "Good evening, Cotton Creek," he said, projecting confidence. "I stand here on behalf of the Cole family. Together we chose to embrace the future rather than cling to the past." A ripple of applause moved through the hall. He basked in it, eyes glinting under the stage lights. He launched into a polished speech about reimagining rural America. He spoke of how farming was no longer sustainable and how visionary leadership was needed. "My father-in-law, Henry Cole," he said, voice heavy with false respect, recognized the need for change. Out of love and foresight, he supported this transition. Emily looked at the floor, unable to meet the crowd's gaze. I could see her fingers clench at the hem of her dress. From my seat at the back, I felt the words burn. Weak, confused, resigned. That was the portrait he painted of me. I rose slowly, leaning on the cane I didn't truly need but carried for steadiness. The murmurs spread as heads turned. The so-called frail old farmer walked steadily toward the front. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, "that's not what happened." Scott froze mid-sentence. Emily's eyes widened. The crowd shifted in their chairs, sensing something more dramatic than zoning proposals was about to unfold. I stepped up beside him, facing the people I had known most of my life. "Scott Mercer claims we made a family decision," I said, pulling a folded paper from my jacket. "But let's talk about facts. This land, 480 acres, was appraised at $3.9 million. Scott sold it for barely over $1 million. Can anyone here call that stewardship?" Scott forced a chuckle. "Market value, Henry. Developers don't pay fantasy prices." "And where," I asked, eyes steady on his. Is the money now? A hush fell. Scott's jaw tightened. It's invested, he muttered. Invested, I repeated. In luxury suites, champagne breakfasts, and Super Bowl tickets. Don't take my word for it. Take his. I raised my phone, scrolling through Scott's public posts. Selfies at the Tulsa Sky Resort, glasses of Dom Perignon held high, hashtags bragging about wealth and success. Gasps filled the room. Scott's polished exterior cracked. You don't understand modern finance, he snapped. You've lost touch with reality. Someone had to handle things. I let the silence stretch before unfolding another document. The power of attorney he had shoved in front of me while I was half conscious. I held it up. This paper gave him authority over medical decisions, not financial ones. He forged my consent. Ruth Ellison, who had slipped quietly into the crowd earlier, stepped forward now. I'm Ruth Ellison, attorney for Henry Cole. This document is clear. It does not grant financial control. The bank and Mr. Mercer acted outside its authority. The words dropped like stones in the hushed hall. Scott's composure collapsed. His voice rose, edged with desperation. He's confused. He doesn't understand. He's old, weak. Enough, I cut in, my tone sharper than I intended. You've lied enough. And now it's time the truth was heard. I turned to the crowd. You want to know who owns Harbor Rock Developments? You think Scott sold my land to some faceless corporation? I paused, watching his color drain. He sold it to Prairie Metrics Labs, a company I founded, a company I still control. Which means he didn't just sell my land, he sold it to me. The room erupted in whispers, the sound of disbelief rolling through the hall. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Scott's face blanched as if the floor had vanished beneath him. I laid the documents on the counsel's table, Ruth opening her briefcase to spread incorporation papers and ownership records for all to see. So, the truth is simple, I said, my voice steady now. This man sold land that wasn't his for a fraction of its value, and he sold it to the very person he thought he was outsmarting. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the weight of the revelation sank into the room. The farmer they had dismissed as worn and outdated had just revealed himself as the master of both land and law, and Scott Mercer, the self-styled visionary, stood exposed under the harshest light of all, the truth. For a long moment, the community center was frozen in silence. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than any voice. Farmers shifted in their seats. Council members shuffled their papers without looking up. And Emily stood with her hands pressed to her face, pale as linen. Scott, once so smooth in his delivery, now stood sweating under the stage lights, the color drained from his cheeks. He cleared his throat and tried to recover his footing. This is all a trick, he stammered, pointing at the documents Ruth had laid out. Henry doesn't understand. He's confused. He's been sick. You all know he isn't capable of handling complex decisions anymore. I acted to protect our family. But the crowd no longer nodded. Where there had been applause minutes before, there was only skepticism. A farmer in the second row muttered, "Protect the family by selling us out?" The words carried through the hall, feeding the whispers that rose like dry grass catching fire. Emily's voice broke through next. It was soft, trembling, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You told me the hospital bills weren't covered," she said, eyes locked on Scott. "You said we needed money or Dad wouldn't survive." Her voice cracked. "You lied." The weight of her realization hung heavy in the air. People gasped. Some turned to one another in shock. Ruth stepped forward, calm as stone. She gathered the stack of papers and fanned them on the council's table. "For the record," she said, her voice measured, "Prairie Metrics Labs owns Harbor Rock Developments. Mr. Cole is the controlling shareholder. The power of attorney signed in June only granted medical authority. It did not authorize any financial decisions. Furthermore, bank records show the proceeds of the sale were spent not on medical care, but on luxury resorts, sporting events, and personal indulgence." She looked directly at Scott. "That is fraud. That is theft, and that is conspiracy." The words hit harder than any shout could have. Scott's shoulders sagged, his posture collapsing as if the suit that once made him appear powerful was now too heavy to carry. His voice lost its polish, replaced by desperation. "It was a misunderstanding," he pleaded. I thought it was best. Emily, you know me. You know I meant well. Stand with me, please." Emily shook her head, tears streaming freely now. She took a step back, refusing to touch his outstretched hand. The silence of that refusal was louder than any accusation. I stepped forward, planting my cane against the wood floor with a firm thud. "Scott Mercer," I said, my voice steady, "you stole what was not yours. You lied to my daughter. You lied to this community. Now you have a choice. You can cooperate, make restitution, face the law honestly, or you can keep pretending and watch as the full weight of justice falls on you." The crowd murmured again, louder this time. "He betrayed his own father-in-law," one woman whispered. "All for money," said another. The tide of public opinion had turned, and Scott stood at its center, stripped of applause, stripped of dignity. His lips trembled as he looked around, eyes darting from face to face, finding no ally. Slowly, his head lowered. "I'll cooperate," he muttered, the words barely audible. "Words are cheap," I replied, not softening. "Actions will decide." Emily moved toward me then, her voice small but strong. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. I drew her close, her tears wetting the shoulder of my shirt. "You're not the enemy," I told her quietly. "You were misled. That's not your sin." She clung to me as though letting go would mean falling apart. I turned back to Scott. "This isn't over. Tomorrow morning, charges will be filed. What happens to you depends on how you face them." Chairman Daniels, clearly shaken, cleared his throat and struck the gavel against the table. "This meeting is adjourned," he declared. The sound echoed through the hall like a final judgment. The crowd began to disperse in a storm of whispers. Farmers shook their heads. Townsfolk muttered about betrayal and shame. Emily remained by my side, her face pale but resolute. Scott stayed rooted to the stage, his shoulders slumped, staring at the floorboards as if they might swallow him whole. The confident man who had strutted to the podium 20 minutes earlier now stood alone, exposed and broken. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the story had already traveled farther than any wildfire. Cotton Creek was buzzing. At the diner, folks leaned over steaming cups of coffee, retelling how Scott Mercer had been exposed in front of the entire town. At church that Sunday, whispers followed Emily down the pews, pity in some faces, disapproval in others. People shook their heads, murmuring about arrogance, betrayal, and greed. The Cole name still carried respect, but Scott's reputation was in ashes. He felt it immediately. Friends who once slapped him on the back now crossed the street to avoid him. The hardware store stopped extending him credit. The feed supplier who used to entertain his big ideas refused to take his calls. Even online, the tide had turned. Screenshots of his luxury posts at the Tulsa Sky Resort circulated with mocking captions, "Paid for with Dad's land." What he had once flaunted now became evidence, turned against him in the court of public opinion. The legal machine moved quickly. Ruth Ellison wasted no time filing official complaints with the county prosecutor. Fraud, theft, conspiracy. The words carried weight heavier than any insult. Cotton Creek Savings and Trust launched its own internal review, worried about their exposure. Letters piled in at Scott's mailbox, formal notices, demands for disclosure, subpoenas sealed with the state's crest. What he once called a business move was now unraveling as a criminal matter. Meanwhile, I returned to the prairie. Each evening, I walked the fence lines as the sun dipped low, painting the grass in streaks of amber and gold. The land whispered the same truth it always had. Storms pass, seasons turn, and the soil endures. But people falter. Betrayal leaves a scar no rain can wash away. I let the quiet of the field steady me, even as the weight of what had been lost pressed down harder than my cane. Emily came to me one evening, her eyes red and swollen. She stood on the porch like she had as a girl, hesitant to speak. "Dad," she whispered, "I knew something was wrong. I saw the way he twisted things, but I wanted to believe in him. I wanted to believe he could build something real. I ignored what was right in front of me," her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." I pulled her into my arms, feeling her shoulders shake. "You carry no blame for his choices," I told her softly. "Trust isn't a sin, it's a gift." "He's the one who squandered it," she wept into my shirt, and I held her until the night air grew cool. For all that Scott had taken, I refused to let him steal my daughter's worth. Evidence mounted in the weeks that followed. Scott had burned through more than $200,000 in less than 2 months. His investments were laughable. A self-styled consulting firm with no clients, influencer schemes that collapsed before they started, luxury purchases with no resale value. Creditors circled like vultures. The life he flaunted so boldly was built on sand, and now the tide was rushing in. Ruth proposed something unusual as part of restitution: community service on local farms. If he wants to understand what it means to build something, let him feel the weight of real work, she said. The idea spread quickly, neighbors nodding at the poetic justice. A man who mocked the soil would now bend his back to it. Meanwhile, Harbor Rock felt the pressure. With Prairie Metrics' ownership revealed and legal challenges mounting, the developers pulled back. Local headlines splashed across the paper. Harbor Rock projects stalled amid ownership dispute. Their shiny banners came down. Survey markers vanished from the prairie. The land breathed easier, as though it too had been vindicated. Yet even with those victories, I could not escape the heaviness inside. Losing money never mattered. Losing trust did. I had welcomed Scott into my home, into my family, only to watch him trade kinship for greed. That wound cut deeper than the sale, deeper than any lawsuit could mend. One September morning, I found a letter in my mailbox stamped with the seal of the county court. Inside was the official notice, a civil lawsuit scheduled, and a criminal indictment likely to follow. I carried it inside, set it on the oak table, where generations of my family had eaten their meals, and let my hand rest on the envelope. "This is only the beginning," I whispered. The prairie outside was still, but the storm in our lives had only begun its reckoning. Ruth sat across from me at her desk, papers spread like a battlefield map. Her voice was calm but firm as she tapped each pile with her pen. "We go at this from 2 angles," she said. "The criminal case, fraud, theft, conspiracy. The prosecutor has everything they need to proceed. And the civil lawsuit, we'll demand restitution, damages, and asset forfeiture. The law may move slowly, Henry, but it does move, and with what we have, it will move in our favor." I nodded, the weight of her words steadying me. For months I had carried betrayal like a stone pressing down on my chest. Now, for the first time, I felt the ground shifting under Scott's feet instead of mine. Word had spread through Cotton Creek, and something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who once kept polite distance now showed up at my door. Farmers brought over tools, spare lumber, even casseroles, the old kind of country solidarity you can't buy with a dime. One old friend placed a small bag of heirloom seeds in my hand. "Your land deserves to grow again," he said, his voice gruff. I felt my throat tighten. These were more than seeds. They were faith, a reminder that the prairie's roots ran deeper than greed. Emily surprised me most. The shame that had weighed on her shoulders began to transform into resolve. She sat with Ruth, combing through bank statements and contracts, keeping meticulous notes. She told me one evening, her eyes steady, "If they need my testimony, I'll give it. I believed him when I shouldn't have, but I won't stay silent now." For the first time since her mother's passing, I saw in her the quiet fire that had run through our family for generations. Meanwhile, Scott's world shrank. Creditors swarmed him like flies to a carcass. Business contacts that once toasted his ambition stopped answering his calls. His social media accounts, once filled with applause, now overflowed with ridicule. People reposted his champagne photos with captions like #funded by fraud. He left voicemails on my phone, his voice sliding between bravado and begging. "Henry, we can work this out. You don't want to drag family through court." I never answered. Some silences are more powerful than words. On the farm, I turned my hands back to work. One afternoon, I hauled out the old plow, rusted from years in the shed. With wire brushes, grease, and patience, I brought it back to life. The steel shone again, and when I hitched it to the tractor and turned the soil, I felt something inside me shift. The land was reclaiming itself, and so was I. Renewal doesn't come from shortcuts, it comes from work. During one meeting, Ruth suggested an idea that caught me off guard. What if we used part of Prairie Metrics' resources to start a scholarship fund? Agricultural students, kids from families like yours. It would turn this mess into opportunity. I sat back, letting the thought settle. To take what Scott had tried to destroy and use it to plant hope for the next generation. That felt like justice. Emily took her own steps forward. She visited neighbors, explaining the truth face to face. "My father never agreed to the sale," she told them. "Scott lied to me, too." Her courage steadied my name in the community more than any lawyer's brief could. I saw respect return to people's eyes when they looked at her. She was rebuilding not just my standing, but her own. The case file grew thick. Ruth and I stacked contracts, Instagram screenshots, bank withdrawals, and affidavits into a neat arsenal of proof. Every piece was another nail in the coffin Scott had built for himself. The tide was turning, and this time, I wasn't caught flat-footed. On the eve of the first hearing, headlights swept across my driveway. Scott stood at my porch, shoulders slumped, his once polished suit wrinkled. His voice cracked as he begged, "Henry, please. Don't let them put me in jail. I can change. You have to believe me. Jail will ruin me." I listened in silence, the prairie wind rattling the porch boards. His words meant little. When he finished, I said only, "Tomorrow, the law will decide." His eyes searched mine for softness, but found none. He turned and walked into the darkness, smaller than I had ever seen him. That night, I sat at the oak table, the files stacked neatly beside me. Emily placed her hand over mine. "We're ready," she said. I looked at her, at the strength she carried now, and nodded. "Tomorrow," I whispered, "we close this chapter." Outside, the prairie wind rattled the windows, a drumbeat steady and sure, carrying us into the reckoning ahead. The county courthouse in Cotton Creek hadn't seen this much attention in years. Reporters with notepads and cameras lined the steps, and locals crowded in, eager for seats. The old wooden benches groaned under the weight of neighbors who wanted to see justice, or gossip, play out in real time. I sat with Ruth at the plaintiff's table, papers neatly stacked, calm in my posture, though my heart thudded with steady resolve. Across the aisle, Scott looked like a hollowed-out version of the man who once strutted around in luxury resorts. His suit was wrinkled, his face drawn pale, sweat dampening his collar. When the judge entered, the bailiff called the room to order. The prosecutor rose, voice steady as stone, and began listing the charges: fraud, theft, falsifying legal documents. Each word struck the room like a hammer. I watched Scott fidget, his hands wringing together as the list went on. For every count, I felt less anger and more pity. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a man undone by greed and arrogance. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their evidence. A projector lit up the white wall of the courtroom, showing Scott's own Instagram posts. Champagne bottles held high, infinity pools at the Tulsa Sky Resort, captions bragging about a millionaire mindset. The jury leaned forward, some shaking their heads. Then came the bank statements, each withdrawal traced like footprints in the sand. Thousands for luxury, thousands more for hollow seminars, not a cent toward medical care. Finally, the power of attorney appeared on the screen, its clear clause underlined, medical decisions only. The courtroom buzzed. Scott sank lower in his chair. When Emily's name was called, the room hushed. She walked to the witness stand with her shoulders squared, but her hands trembling. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, and sat down, eyes briefly meeting mine. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She told them how Scott insisted the hospital bills weren't covered, how he spun a story of desperation, how she believed him because she wanted to. Tears welled in her eyes, but her honesty never faltered. "He lied," she said simply, her voice breaking. The jury watched her closely, compassion softening their expressions. Scott's lawyer tried to fight back. He painted Scott as misguided but well-intentioned, a man burdened with responsibility for an ailing father-in-law. He repeated the phrase misunderstanding, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But, under cross-examination, Scott stumbled. He admitted he hadn't read The Power of Attorney fully. He admitted he hadn't consulted Emily before spending. His bravado crumbled into stammering, and the jury saw him for what he was, a fraud. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with my cane tapping against the polished floor. I told them about the land, how my grandfather broke the first soil with nothing but a mule and determination, how my father built fences by hand, how I spent decades blending farming with technology to create prairie metrics. This wasn't about money, I said, my voice carrying through the quiet room. It was about respect. 4 generations lived on that land, and my son-in-law erased it for 6 weeks of champagne and shopping. He didn't just steal property. He stole trust. I caught the eyes of the jurors, farmers, shopkeepers, neighbors, and I knew they understood. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on fraud, guilty on theft, guilty on falsifying documents. The words seemed to echo against the old wood-paneled walls. Scott's face collapsed, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for an escape that no longer existed. The judge's voice was solemn as she delivered the sentence. 5-year probation, full restitution of $96,000, and 1,000 hours of community service on local firms. His professional license revoked, his reputation finished. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, "you will repay not just with money, but with work. Perhaps you will learn the value of honest labor." Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps afterward, snapping photos, shouting questions. Headlines appeared before the ink was dry. "Farmer wins against greedy son-in-law." Strangers shook my hand, thanking me for standing firm, for proving that age does not mean weakness. That evening, back at the farmhouse, I set the case files on the oak table and let the quiet settle around me. Emily sat across from me, her eyes still swollen but filled with something steadier. Relief, perhaps, or resolve. I traced the grain of the table with my fingers, thinking of all the meals, all the arguments, all the laughter it had held. "This was never about land or money," I whispered. "It was about respect." The prairie outside stirred in the evening wind, steady and eternal, carrying with it the promise that, while people may falter, the land remembers. Tomorrow would bring new burdens, but for tonight, justice had spoken. Weeks passed after the verdict, and Cotton Creek slowly returned to its rhythm. The courthouse drama that once filled every conversation at the diner faded into memory, replaced by talk of weather patterns, cattle auctions, and harvest yields. Tractors rumbled down the county roads again. Farmers tipped their hats at me as they passed, and the prairie exhaled as though relieved the storm had moved on. Scott's name lingered only as a cautionary whisper. He had begun his community service, working under men who once looked up to him as Emily's ambitious husband. Now he mucked stalls, hauled hay, and fixed fences in the cold dawn light, his once polished hands blistered and cracked. Some laughed at the sight, but others nodded. Justice wasn't always about prison bars. Sometimes it was about humility earned through sweat. His arrogance had been stripped bare, leaving him a figure no longer feared or admired, but pitied. Back at the farm, the land stirred with life again. With Emily's help, we tilled the fields, planted new rows, and set prairie metric sensors deep in the soil to track moisture and nutrients. Data flowed to my computer, confirming what I already felt in my bones. The land was thriving again. Watching seedlings break through the earth reminded me of resilience. Prairie grass had survived fire, drought, and storms. It would survive betrayal, too. Emily changed with the season as well. She no longer walked in Scott's shadow, no longer softened her words to cover his pride. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves, joined me in meetings with Ruth, and even began reviewing Prairie Metrics projects with a sharp eye. One evening, she surprised me by suggesting improvements for a soil monitor we were testing. "Mom always said you built things to last," she told me, her tone steady. "I want to be part of that." For the first time, I saw not just my daughter, but a partner rising to carry forward the legacy. Word spread quickly about Scott's new role in town, not as a leader, but as a laborer. His humiliation became a living parable. Children whispered about him at school. Farmers smirked when they saw him bent over fence posts. Yet, as weeks stretched into months, the laughter dulled. People began to see him less as entertainment and more as a man paying back what he owed, 1 hour at a time. Whether it would change him permanently remained uncertain, but the community recognized that justice had taken root. Meanwhile, Ruth and I followed through with an idea that transformed pain into promise. Together we announced the Prairie Metrics Agricultural Scholarship, a fund for local kids who dreamed of studying agricultural science and engineering. At the next town hall, I stood before neighbors and declared, "This community deserves investment, not exploitation. The next generation will have the tools to make farming stronger than ever." Applause filled the room, not polite but thunderous, echoing through the rafters. The first scholarship went to a farmer's daughter bound for Oklahoma State University, her face alight with pride. That moment told me our legacy was bigger than one man's betrayal. The media shifted as well. National outlets ran a final story, not about scandal, but about resilience. Betrayal turns into legacy. Farmer creates scholarship after son-in-law's fraud. They called me the invisible builder, the man who turned treachery into opportunity. For once, I didn't resent the spotlight. If the story inspired others to protect what they built, to stand firm in the face of betrayal, it was worth it. At home, the oak table remained my anchor. One night, Emily sat across from me, her face warm in the glow of the lamp. She reached for my hand. "You taught me something, Dad," she said softly. "Strength isn't about clinging to anger. It's about standing for what's right, no matter how much it hurts." Her words settled in me like seed in fertile soil. I thought of Scott then, still bent over bales of hay somewhere, his future uncertain. Whether he would truly learn from this or remain trapped in bitterness was no longer my burden. The law had done its work. Now the rest was his to carry. As the sun set over the prairie one evening, I stood at the fence line, watching the fields glow gold beneath the sky. The land stretched wide, steady, and alive, as it always had. I breathed deep and let the lesson settle in my bones. Greed may shake a family, but respect rebuilds it. Legacy isn't measured in money or titles. It is written in the choices we make, the lessons we pass on, and the work we leave behind. The prairie whispered back with the rustle of grass, timeless and forgiving, reminding me that while people may falter, the land endures, and in that endurance lay the truest legacy of all. In the quiet after betrayal, what remains is not the sound of anger, but the echo of lessons learned. Families, like fields, can weather storms of greed, disappointment, and loss. Yet their roots are tested in the moments when trust is broken. It is in those moments that true character is revealed, not in the abundance of wealth or the shine of appearances, but in the resilience to stand firm when everything feels shaken. Betrayal is painful because it comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us. Yet, even in that pain lies a chance to rediscover what cannot be stolen: dignity, integrity, and the strength to choose accountability over silence. Wealth may change hands, land may be threatened, but the values that endure, respect, honesty, responsibility, are the real inheritance we leave behind. Injustice has a way of unmasking itself. Lies unravel, greed collapses, and false promises crumble beneath the weight of truth. The path toward justice is seldom easy, yet each step taken to defend what is right becomes a seed planted for the future. Those seeds grow not only into restored trust, but into a legacy that serves generations yet to come. In the end, the measure of a life is not counted in dollars spent or possessions lost, but in the steadiness with which one protects what matters most. Respect is not inherited, it is earned. And though betrayal may shake the ground beneath us, it is resilience, guided by principle, that rebuilds what was broken and ensures that the story we leave is one of honor, not regret. These lessons are meant to inspire you to live fully and authentically. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Take a moment to reflect and share one thing you've learned and plan to apply in your own life. Let's support each other on this journey toward embracing these truths. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment with 1. If not, feel free to comment with 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life on your own terms.